Well, thanks for joining me, everyone, and welcome to the live series Roundtable. Obviously, we're going to be speaking about diversity and inclusion today, specifically from an interviewing and technical perspective. Obviously, I'm joined by four fantastic guests, all with a wealth of experience, and we'll get into those introductions very shortly. Now, first and foremost, I'm Sam. I'm one of the senior consultants here at Amicus, having spent 3 years recruiting across the Python and data space. Amicus, who we are, as the name may say, we're a friend to the tech community. So a lot of the things we do outside of just purely recruitment are hosting areas for discussion and things like that. So that's the background to the live series and this event, I suppose. So I'll hand it first over to Asim. Do you want to give yourself a quick introduction, please?
Sure. Thanks, Sam. So I'm Asim. My main background is from fintech. So I worked for a lot of investment bank as well as fintechs. Been a software engineering manager for a while, done project management roles, delivery management roles, and been a developer when I started.
Fantastic. Cheers, Asim. And Ben?
Nice to meet you. I'm Ben Omani. I'm CEO and co-founder of Jobs ASI, which is building generative AI tools for talent teams in-house and recruitment. Before that, I was head of data engineering at Infogrid and previously a bunch of other data roles. And going back even further, I was started off in recruitment for my sins. So yeah, a bit of a mixed background there.
Fantastic. And Carmen, do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sam. So I'm Carmen. I'm the manager of the data science and data analytics teams at Typeform, where I've been working for the past 2 years. And previously to that, I've been working as data scientist myself on several roles in several industries, going from retail to consultancy. And before that, I did a PhD in physics, so a long time ago. And I'm super excited to be here today.
Fantastic. And obviously, last but not least, Toby.
All right, Sam. I'm Toby. I'm a consultant CTO. I spent more than 10 years working as a CTO with SaaS companies.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming and joining us today, everyone. As I mentioned, we're going to be discussing diversity and inclusion. Obviously, it's a massive part of talent and obviously engineering teams. So the way we wanted to look at it was obviously during the interview process, sort of looking at sort of different strategies and maybe pitfalls and things that companies struggle with, but also a chance to debate and talk about good and important topic as it is. So I suppose we can't start without understanding what D&I actually is. So I suppose for each of you, what would you class as diversity and inclusion? So where do we start with this sort of topic? Anyone want to kick off?
No, I can start. So diversity for me means how many different perspectives do we have on the table? If I have to generalize this, do we have as many perspectives on the table or not? And inclusion means your own working environment in the office or the workplace. Does everybody feel comfortable? Do they feel empowered to say anything without having any fear of repercussions? So how healthy is your environment?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, sorry, Karen, Ben, jump on.
I was just going to say, for me, I think the easiest way I've heard it be described is diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is people actually speaking to you when you're there. So that makes it easy for me to.
Fantastic. Love that analogy there. So I suppose then when we're looking at it from a talent perspective in a hiring process, or looking at addressing the interview process, how do we start that conversation in terms of where does that start for people? Where does diversity and inclusion start?
For me, it starts even before we post a job or list a job, even before we start the interviewing process. It starts with a job description. Depending on several factors like how is it written, if it's very qualitative or if it's very quantitative and so on, there's going to be more likely to have already a bias in who applies to it. There might be people that feel more kind of scared because, I'm not matching all the requirements that are listed there, for instance. Or like, I don't feel like they are really including me in that sort of list or something like that. So in the end, a job description, it's just like the presentation of what we're looking for. And we need to be very mindful of how we read it. We read it to make sure that we are not excluding people from the very beginning.
At the risk of making it sort of making this sound a bit like a Four Yorkshiremen sketch, I would almost say that there is a stage beyond that we can sort of go one step further back, which is it's not just the description of the role, it's actually the role itself. I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion about diversity and inclusion at the recruitment phase, but really the most important thing is to think about your day-to-day working processes and to kind of start from there. Because if you're thinking about your workplace and your working processes and constructing those so that they're actively designed to make diverse, inclusive communities feel comfortable and productive and at home, then that experience is kind of going to propagate to your recruitment process. I guess I see it as a kind of build it and they will come sort of philosophy. So that instead of trying to force diversity into my teams, I'm trying to build an environment in which a diverse team can flourish and allow that to propagate up to the recruitment process. And obviously, then the next step beyond that becomes writing the perfect sort of job description, and as you say, kind of tying into the beginning of that process. But for me, the primary goal would always be to try and make sure the role itself was designed to be as diverse and inclusive as possible.
I suppose as leaders, CTOs, engineering managers, as you guys are, how do we make sure that that's the case? And how can we make sure that the role is going to be applicable in that sort of way? How can we ensure that?
So I think there's a piece here, and I think it's a really good point that you brought up, Toby. So you actually have to want to have a team that doesn't operate in exactly the same way in each individual team member. Like, I don't know, Sam, you've probably had briefs like this where someone said, can you get me another of X? Like, you know, and actually that it sounds like, oh, we've got a superstar, let's get another, right? But the reality is, you know, there's this whole paper around like the too much talent effect. I don't know if you've seen this, where if you had a team of Michael Jordans, it would be a nightmare because no one would pass to each other. Like, so actually you have to first go in with that mentality of like, I want to build a team that is not just hyper specialized in one area, but actually a really good group of generalists, maybe sure in a specific like discipline like software engineering or data engineering, but has exposure to, you know, different experiences that actually help them build better products. There's a lot of studies that say more diverse teams build, you know, better products. And actually you need to make sure that you've got that in your culture, in your team, that everyone in the team is bought into that. And those are the sort of building blocks you need to do before you can just go and say, right, but like, you know, let's go and you know, build a diverse team. Otherwise you're actually not building on strong foundations, you're building on sand.
Always like this analogy. I love, Ben, the comment of like, why do you need diversity actually, right? When you're trying to solve one problem and you've got 10 people that thinks quite similarly, you're only going to face a problem in one way. And you cannot think outside the box because you're always going to think in the same way. When you have a diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of gender, a diversity of cultures, a diversity of things, that gives you the opportunity to attack the problem from different angles. That meaning that you will be able to solve that problem in a way more fast and more agile and probably a more effective way as well. So in the end, what you want is to make a team, not of the same type of individuals, but that everybody brings something new and that together are able to actually rise up the level of the team.
I suppose within an engineering or a product space, has anyone got any examples of when that's been super effective, when you've seen that, I suppose, change from everyone looking and searching in what or working in one way to actually seeing that diversification actually becoming really beneficial in one? Has anyone got any examples, I suppose, of how that's worked?
I've certainly experienced the process of trying to make teams more inclusive to be a real positive in itself. Because I think, as Carmen says, having loads of different perspectives is really, really positive. But getting those different people to talk to each other and building communication processes and sort of systems that allow those people to work alongside each other in a productive way, I guess, helping Michael Jordan to pass to his teammates is a process that I've seen really, really improve teams. So, looking at perhaps asynchronous communication mechanisms, or looking at the sort of language that you use when talking between one another, looking at the different sort of even technologies that you can use to communicate, I've really seen improve the ways that teams work with one another. And that's often improved not just the ability for a team to take on new perspectives, but even just within the same set of sort of people that have been in the team in perpetuity, seeing the improvements of communication amongst those people from the same systems and processes that allow them to engage with sort of other groups has been really, really positive.
I think the really obvious examples I've seen have been from engineers joining teams who are deaf or colorblind or of limited vision. Like, these are classic areas when, if you're building a UI, your people who don't fit into those categories aren't going to think in that way. And I know it's a very easy example for engineering because we see it all the time. People still design UIs that aren't totally inclusive, and now there's tooling available that allows you to check with these things. But yeah, that's a really clear and obvious example of when I remember at Curve we had a colorblind engineer join, and that was just like, right, okay, good. Actually, he's immediately saw some issues that we had with like readability on the app, and was able to suggest changes to the design team. So that that was great.
Yeah, and Toby mentioned that he tries to create an environment where people can take the benefit of diversity. I think that's a very important point, because if you think about it, people want to work with people of like them. If you consider sports, especially, people are comfortable working with people who are similar to them. But then understanding what diversity bring onto the table also needs the right environment to be there, and the team to be educated enough to understand that this is the impact that this is going to bring to the table.
I think you put a point of education there, Asim, which I think is a really important point, especially because it's such a wide part of the engineering teams going forward, isn't it? These sort of topics, and how do we make sure that if they're not just at the forefront of recruitment, it's not just, oh, I'm bringing in this team member, so I need to look at this, but then look at the whole, I suppose, the life cycle within teams, and making sure that everyone is educated. How do you make sure that that's adhered to within your teams, and I suppose followed throughout the whole time within your business? How is that something that can be looked at?
I think it comes from top down, basically in an organization. I worked for various investment banks, and one of the good examples that I have, without naming anyone, was when I joined that firm, I had not experienced the team, the environment like that before in a positive way. Everyone was an extremely good team man, and that was the first time I actually got to see the benefit of people coming from various backgrounds and actually working together to achieve. And they are one of the bigger names in the world, probably the biggest name in the world. And to get to that stage, the recruitment process that they build, I now understand has gotten them where they are. So I've seen it firsthand. Recruitment process is absolutely necessary. But the what comes before that is what Toby mentioned earlier. You have to have the environment in the organization first. Otherwise, you're going to create conflicts within the organization.
And from an education perspective, how do you make sure that's running throughout? As you said, from the top down. So how do we make sure that everyone is educated from the highest all the way through to your earliest starters? How do we make sure that's something that's achieved?
I think example is the perfect way to actually make people more open. So if you want an environment in a company that is inclusive, be inclusive yourself. Like everybody, like it needs to go from the top and going down. Like how many LT boards we've seen with a big gender bias. Do you want to have a company with no gender bias? Just start from the top. Like start yourself. Just giving the example of surrounding you with people of a diverse type of background, gender, whatever it is. So you need that. You need to show by example, but you also need sometimes to force it. There's not going to be naturally. There's always going to be natural biases in our industry, especially when we're talking about engineering, when we're talking about data, when we're talking about these things. There's always going to be some bias because we are a biased society. That it's normal, but we need sometimes to enforce diversity itself so it can naturally grow into the company and then grow from there.
I think there's a really good point there, because I think one of the big things for me is it's impossible to sort of talk to people about the promised land of, that how good a more diverse team, or how much better it feels when you've got multiple points of opinion and different people with different backgrounds sharing different ways of doing things, until you sort of truly experience it. And I think that sometimes, especially in smaller startups, it's something that's very difficult to get going at the beginning, but actually you see a real difference and change in the culture when you have a more inclusive and diverse team, and you see those teams perform a lot better. So it's one of those ones where it's really difficult to explain why it's much better until you sort of experience it yourself personally. And I think that's maybe some of the issue as well. Like you said, there is historic bias, and you can't correct those historic biases over, even the course of decades, right? Because, that's where people's training come from, that, like their access to education, etc. These things, they take a while to propagate through the system. So it's really important to sort of, for people to see that happening. And yeah, that was something that I thought, yeah, Carmen and Asim, that really sort of stuck out from what you said.
Yeah, fantastic. And I suppose then it sort of segues us quite nicely onto the next step of, you mentioned obviously, Carmen, making sure that it's there. How do we do that in the interview process then? How does D&I play a heavy effect, or how does D&I affect the interview process at its core? Then how do we make sure we're adhering to it? Obviously, first thing we mentioned was obviously the job postings. That was the first level. How do we propagate that then through to the other areas? How do we make sure it's like, is there any examples of it seeing well, or on the opposite side of it performing poorly?
I guess I would take a similar approach to sort of the kind of first principles approach that I've taken to D&I in the wider workplace. Is if you want to make sure that your interview process is as inclusive as possible, you want to make it sure it's as similar as possible to actually working in your company. Because if you're trying to hire someone to do a role, the more closely you can match the process of doing well in that role to your interview process, to your recruitment process, then the better your hires are going to be for that role. And if you can combine that with making sure that the working experience is supportive for a diversity of team members, then your recruitment process should naturally become more sort of inclusive. I guess sort of to show some sort of examples of that, perhaps, I've had roles where it's an engineering role and most of the design requirements are communicated in text and are assessed and responded to sort of asynchronously, particularly sort of remote roles these days. And I've seen people do interview processes for those, which involve picking up the phone and calling them, doing a video call with somebody and asking them to go and talk through a problem. And that's not the skill set that's really being used in that role on the day-to-day basis. And so people who don't communicate well by video, people who struggle in those environments, are not being fairly assessed through that process for that individual role. So on the complete other end of the spectrum, you may have teams. I'm a huge supporter of teams spending a lot of time pair programming, particularly in remote working environments. And if you've got teams that work like that, then doing a pair programming exercise over a video call is a fantastic way to go and assess people for that role. Obviously, you should think carefully about whether that working process is the best working process and whether you're excluding people from who might be good at solving the problems in general by working in that way. But once you've decided that's the right way to work, matching your interview process to that working process, I think, is one of the strongest ways that you can go and sort of increase the diversity of your hiring process. And I think the other thing that sort of comes naturally from that is, if you are struggling with the education process that you've sort of talked about, if you're struggling to show people how having a diversity of opinion is going to go and help them, you can actually use your candidates to educate people about that. If they're working on problems and working in similar ways that they would be if they were actually in your team, then you've got a constant flow of people who can show you what it's like working and seeing those different perspectives. And I think I've certainly seen teams that have actually, used problems that are very, very close to the things that they're actually struggling with in their interview processes, and got outside sort of insights and perspectives on them, which somewhat feels like cheating, but is fantastic for the interview process.
But I think you mentioned, obviously, communication there being a huge one. There's so many different types of communication within engineering, especially now that the world has gone so remote and you have these opportunities to work with engineering teams all across Europe. I know I work with companies that have that complete European team, and limiting yourself to, as you said, just a phone call or a video call can be so detrimental to not seeing the best people for that. I think that's a fantastic point to mention in terms of making sure that if you're communicating, whether it be via Slack or any other text-based communication, that's then replicated in your, obviously, well, vice versa, isn't it? It's replicated in your interview process, rather than getting someone to do an arbitrary task and then expecting them to come in and communicate perfectly on a call. And I think that's a fantastic point to pull up. And is there any other similar, I suppose, maybe skills that we've seen that have fallen short because interviews haven't been inclusive? Is there anything else anyone can think of that we can change or implement to tackle?
One of the things that it's quite common when we are doing an interview process for a data position is to give a home assignment. So you give a home assignment and you go a few days to actually do it. And I've always found that can be not fair for a lot of people, especially people with families. For instance, when you have time, you can dedicate a lot of time to actually prepare a home assignment, and you can do a pretty good job. Instead of investing 2 hours, investing 10 or 12 or 20 hours into it. And I found that sometimes we are expected to do so, and people with families, it's difficult when it's late, when you finish up your work, you've got the kids. So it's not easy, but it's not only about families, it's also about other things. Maybe afterwards you have other things. So sometimes that particular case, and I found that a lot, especially for data, it's not entirely fair. So one of the things that I would like to do is try to come up with a plan that is as inclusive as possible for every possible situations. And also be very mindful that when you're interviewing someone, you're interviewing a person, a personal life with a personal space, with everything, and try to respect that as well. Because that doesn't mean that they need to do like whatever it takes to actually get the job. The right person should get the job regardless of the amount of time that they can dedicate to that in particular. You should be able to actually give a space for everyone.
So
to be fair and square and get the job if they deserve to. And then, yeah,
I like to flip that around and think of it less as like unfair, but actually like think as a business, how many people that you're going to miss out on, how many talented individuals that you're not going to be able to bring in because you're putting an extra requirement on someone that may disadvantage one group. So that's the thing for me around this that's really critical, is that you make sure you're constricting the number of people that you can hire artificially and reducing the likelihood of you bringing in a really, really talented person because the population's smaller.
And also I love how this connects to Toby, what Toby mentioned before. You want to match the type of job that you're going to do. Are we expecting people to work 20 hours a day? Why are we doing that during the interview process?
I think that's actually really, really interesting, because the sort of the take home tests that people seem to hand out, and I will say I'm not a fan. There's been a lot of sort of discussion that they are more representative, exactly because they're sort of sitting at your desk writing code on your own. If that's what a particular role looks like, then it is sort of representative. But I think you're exactly right. People miss the ancillary factors that make that not like doing your role, like the fact that they're actually being done alongside your role and that they're sort of being piled on top, and not least that yours is not the only position that these people are applying for. It may, you may say it's only a 3-hour process, and that's nothing in the grand scheme of getting a role. But if people are applying for 15 roles, that's significant. That's weeks and weeks of work that people are putting into just going through that process. And so I think it is really, really important that you think about both sides of it. You think about how can we make sure that we do make this representative. I mean, I think there is one side that says if your role does involve sitting on your own in a box writing code and not talking to anyone, perhaps you should think about your working processes a little bit. But you need to make them representative, but you also need to make sure that you think about those ancillary factors that you're talking about.
I also think that the climate changes that as well, right? Where at the moment we're seeing lots more, many fewer roles, many more redundancies. Now, if you think these processes are even more competitive, there's more people. So you're actually talking about, I don't know if we often count how long it takes us to hire and, the number of interviews and the time that we invest in hiring. But actually, if you flip that round, how much are you asking from candidates? Like, how many hours of people's time are you wasting with some of these things? If you're going to ask, if it's easier to say, well, a take-home test doesn't cost us anything, you're passing that cost on. You're actually, really, really costing the economy quite a lot of money. If you're saying, right, 100 people do a take-home test, we're only going to hire one. That's, not a good way of doing business in my mind.
I think, I would definitely double down on that. And I would also say that there is a real benefit if you can surprise people with both your work processes internally and also with your recruitment processes. If you can really make candidates, make your team feel like this has been received a lot of thought, this is something you really care about, that's a really good way to build a very sort of a committed and sort of engaged team. It's also a really good way of improving your success rate when hiring people in a competitive market. You want to have the best people. You want to convince those people during an interview that they want to join you. And if you can make it clear that you have thought about their needs, you've thought about who they are, and you've thought about how they fit into your team, actually you can increase your cost per interview, but you can potentially both reduce your cost to hire and increase the value that you provide to your team simply by making sure that you've sort of improved that process for the people who do come through it.
Yeah, I think there's some really brilliant points within there, especially about identifying these problems within certain areas of take home and pair programming. And because obviously not one process works for one role, not one role works for one individual either. I think one point that was kind of almost washed over by all the other good points was that with the bias that it can be, I suppose, the biases that we've got. How do we, in an interview process, then address bias? Because there's got to be, obviously, Carmen mentioned earlier how there is going to be a point where you need to address in a little bit more of a forceful way diversity, especially maybe at an earlier stage or whatever it be. How do we address the bias of that, and sort of how can we combat or prepare for bias within an interview process?
Sam, if we take example of how sports do talent identification again, there's a term that they use, which is something like multiple eyes, multiple times. I've heard this in various sports, and what that means is you need to see those people more than once, and multiple people need to see it, and multiple opinions need to be formed about the person you're going to hire, right? And I think looking back at my career, there were organizations where the interviews were just with one people or two people max, and then there were some interviews where I had to go through something like over 10 people I met in the organization. And in my experience, when I've met more people, I felt more confident joining that organization. They have felt more confident hiring me as well. And I think that works both ways. And those multiple people that I've spoken to within the organization, then they become my network before I've even joined the organization. So there are multiple benefits of this. And I think that kind of removes the bias, because a lot of those people were from similar background from me as myself, and were from different backgrounds as well. So I think that kind of, for me, if I look back, has been a good hiring process, or one of the better ones that I've come across.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I know a lot of things recently have been more geared towards a term, I'm sure you've all heard of it, but culture add rather than culture fit. And I think that stems from the multiple eyes, multiple times. Sort of, you've got to make sure you've got so many people on that panel to make sure they're all different. But again, it comes from, I think we've all identified that it needs to be different at the start anyway, or else you're not going to get that difference. Because if you don't have different people in the team, then you can't have different interviewers. But has anyone else noticed or seen similar outputs where that's been super successful in their careers, of especially in relation to interview processes?
So, sorry, the question was, have we seen?
Sorry, yeah, in terms of having multiple people on an interview panel, or having maybe only the one or two, or have there been times where either one of those has been super successful for a specific reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another good point in terms of having a diverse panel for the interview. You actually want to make sure that you are following through on that. For example, I think we've had, I've certainly, it's always difficult to hire diverse candidates in software engineering and data. And actually, if you don't have a diverse panel, then actually you're not giving a show really of the fact that they're going to be joining a diverse organization. So actually, that's one thing that you can do to really change things. Now, again, you don't want to go too far to the other extreme and just based on tokenism or anything like that, pressure people into doing more interviews. That would also be an overcorrection. But you need to make sure that actually people are seeing a representative sample of the people that you've got through that process. And actually, for us, I've definitely been in situations where by encouraging people to join interview panels more frequently, that we've actually been able to hire more diverse candidates more successfully without changing the assessment criteria at all, by just them saying, actually, you were one of the only places that I interviewed that had someone who was of a different ethnicity. It wasn't just a panel of straight white dudes. Yeah, I've certainly seen success in terms of securing hiring excellent candidates based on that.
I guess I'd say, oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on this. I think also an interview goes two ways, right? Like you mentioned that before, and you're not only giving the candidate exposure of what it means to be working here, but also you're giving the team the ability to have a voice. So you are empowering the team if they are part of the decision, if they are part of the panel, you're empowering the team of, look, this is not a dictatorial kind of situation. We are a team, and together we are deciding what is the missing piece that we need right now. So you're also empowering the team to participate, and you're giving them the ability to also be more engaged in the future because they are being part of the decision.
I think that's very close to what I was sort of thinking on this, but I would also say even sort of further into the back end of that process, I've definitely seen, when it comes to this bias discussion, that it is easier for a team to say, or for an individual particularly, to say yes to somebody that looks exactly like a sort of a cookie cutter that they've seen before. If somebody who looks like themselves or sort of behaves like themselves, somebody from similar backgrounds, or from similar backgrounds to people that they've worked with and hired before, that's a much easier yes. It's a much easier way for someone to go, yes, I'm safe. I'm sure that's safe. I know I can make that call. And if you're trying to make those decisions on your own, taking risks is a scarier process. It's a more difficult process, riskier process. If there's 5 of you having a discussion, or 3 of you having a discussion, and you can say, these are my experiences of this candidate, these are the things that I think about, and these are sort of you can have that as a discussion with more people. I think you can take more risks in that hiring process because you have more sort of layers, I guess, multiple eyes, multiple times. You have these layers of security. And I think that makes it easier for you to hire people who are, who perhaps look different from your existing candidates, your existing roles, your existing team in superficial ways, but who match the roles very, very well, and who you think would perform well.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose making sure as Ben said, you don't go that other way, i.e. that the tokenism, making sure that the right person still gets the right role, especially in earlier stage businesses or smaller teams, that you've got to, as we said, we need to be making these more diverse teams there. How do we ensure that doesn't creep in then? What things can we put in? What strategies? Might be a really difficult thing to talk about or to think about, but how do we then protect against the opposite?
I think, yeah, it's definitely worth stating that, it is illegal to discriminate even positively during that process. So, a lot of these things have to be in, the total addressable market. That's the whole point of the inclusion piece. You can't, to increase that total addressable market so that it's got the entire potential pool of candidates. And actually, once people are in the process, you should be, there are protected characteristics in law that you should be very certain about, when you're going through the interview process, that you're not discriminating positively or negatively on. So yeah, that's the first thing. But yeah, I think, look, I think you have to be clear that this is something that does matter. And I think that it's something that you would like everyone in the team to play a part in helping to solve. And, I think, yeah, that's, if people are bought into that, then, you're halfway there, right? That's where you start getting people who really, really care about it. And I think the rubber hits the road really when things get harder, maybe, you need to make something happen quicker, and people are saying, oh, that's great, but actually we want to we can't be bothered with that, it's fluffy, we want to do this. And the reality is that is clearly a short-term trade-off that will have negative long-term consequences, and that's something that you want to try and avoid at all points. I'm sure all of us have been in experiences where we've had to take on technical debt, and for me, this is just team debt that's going to build up over time, that's going to give you a suboptimal performance in the long term, and is going to become more difficult to change in the future. Now, there are certain realities, but you want to make sure that you're trying to build the team in the right way, and that you're not just going down the route of the path of least resistance, because you're actually will build a worse team because of that.
That phrase there, I can't bother with that, it's fluffy, I think is really, particularly, we're talking about hiring engineers here, we're talking about sort of our domain. that's something that I've heard a lot.
Phrase I've heard, yes.
In a lot of different domains, in a lot of different. But I think that's actually really interesting. That can be used both ways, right? That can be, I don't care about this sort of team diversity thing because that's fluffy. People don't understand the value to that. But you can also flip that round, and I've seen engineers coming together to make really, really good recruiting teams exactly because they view it like that. You go, what are the things that you're actually trying to hire for? Everything else is fluff. Can you focus on those? And I've seen really, really good hiring teams made up of sort of engineers who see the world like that. And I think that's a really, really good way that you can, well, I guess, to come back to the question, to both cut down on the kind of tokenism approach, but also to improve the sort of what people traditionally see as diversity and inclusivity. That kind of cutting through the fluff is a very strong way to do it.
I think we need to ensure that the funnel, we are not cutting the funnel, right? Like we are getting a huge funnel. Like we are not just looking for one specific person. Like there's no one unicorn, and that's the people that we need to find. There's going to be several people that are going to be capable of doing that in different ways and adding different things. What we want in the end is to have the biggest funnel possible, so we get the most diversity and inclusive environment, and then we can choose from all that diversity environment what is a person who we think at this point in time, it's bringing the most value, independently of any characteristics of the person.
I completely agree, and I think one thing maybe to call out is this idea of, it's really easy to hire someone who's already done the thing, but then you're only going to get the people who've only ever done the thing. And actually, like when we were doing the prep for this call, Asim, I remember your example was particularly poignant in the fact that you were put in a position where you hadn't necessarily done the role before, but you excelled. And that's a perfect example of that in action, right? That if you focus on the right things to hire for, not necessarily they've done exactly the same thing before, but that they work in that way, they think in that way, they've got that leadership, that technical understanding, etc. I don't know, maybe you'd explain it better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the roles I was hired for was a very senior role from at that point where I was in my career, and I felt after joining it, I thought I felt a little bit out of place, but because I was interviewed by lots of people, multiple eyes, multiple times, I felt confident that okay, so many people have said yes, I must be, good for the job. That gave me confidence to go for the first 3 months, and I got really good help. That already I had a network of people there who helped me out in the first 3 months, and after 3 months, I was working independently, and that was ended up being one of the better roles I've done in my career, and learned a lot from that. One important point I think that we might want to touch upon here is because we are speaking about this recruitment process, right? And typically companies hire a recruitment agency to help out. Transferring all of this culture, this understanding what the company culture is, and transferring that, pushing that out to your agent or recruitment company is extremely important. And that's part of what Carmen was saying, increasing the funnel. That's where the funnel will, filter in lots of relevant people or diverse, people from diverse backgrounds. So I think that is also a key point of, to consider. How do you work with, do you stick with just a few recruitment agency, or do you go out with 10 or 15 of them? Or I think sticking with a few is always a good idea, and making sure that they understand your company culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost a completely wider discussion, isn't it? How many agencies to go out to? And I'm always going to be the advocate of go for one, and hopefully that'd be me. But obviously that's just my own biases going in as well, isn't it? But I think we, as Carmen was saying, in terms of keeping that funnel wide, especially when you're talking about going out to your agencies, they're obviously always going to have a network that is going to be wider, because especially the good agencies you'll work with will have that wider aspects, because people that apply to your roles or come directly inadvertently know of the business. There's been many times that I've worked with candidates that have never heard of a business and have then been introduced, that have obviously worked out perfectly because you wouldn't have seen them, or people might not have seen them directly otherwise. So there is that aspect of making sure your, I suppose, initial approaches, your initial funnel is as wide as possible. And I think
my point was to go with a minimum number of agencies, because you want to then educate them about your own company culture. That was I think that's an important point for all of this to actually work out.
People that are representing your business needs to know the business, don't they? You can't just be having someone that, again,
absolutely,
of course. Sorry, Ben.
I'd go a step further and I'd say, look, if like you said, this person is going to be representing you to the wider community, this is probably going to be their major point of contact, right? You want to do exactly the same as if they were an internal recruiter. You want many eyes, many times, build up that relationship, have that understanding. They know about the history of the business. Obviously, you can't do that from scratch, but over time, working very closely, over communicating at the beginning for sure around the team, what's going on, what's been happening in the business, what projects you've got coming up. All of these things are bits of information that with the right recruiter will help them dramatically to find people who are going to be able to help you with that, and widen their pool of people that they can get in contact with and pass on to yourself, which should hopefully result in a better diverse candidate pool. And so if your process is good, a diverse team.
Exactly. I think, it stems from the top up, doesn't it, as we were saying. And I wanted to, I suppose, ask a question in terms of how many times have you gone out to a hire, obviously with your interview process set in stone, you want it in that way it is, and end up finding someone that's almost completely different to the original, not spec, because obviously there's always going to be a spec, but how many times have we seen it where we've gone, oh, actually there is this, as Carmen said, 4 or 5, 6 different types of people that can do the hire or do the role, sorry, but they're completely different to our original thoughts. How many times have we seen that happen?
I mean, constantly, right? Like, I feel like there's, archetypes sometimes maybe, and even then that's just us trying to compartmentalize, what is essentially every individual is entirely different. So, right, and actually I think, especially for single hires, if you're going to hire a one-off person or a specialist, I find that sometimes those are even more, you might not even know what that person might look like. You're actually looking for, to speak with lots of people to understand what you're looking for. Sometimes that's certainly been the case. Less so when I've been in engineering and it's been more sort of focused, and we know a little bit more like the space in which this person's going to be. But actually, it's very interesting to speak to people if you're going into a new area, say in engineering, and you don't know the technologies and the background there, like that problem's probably been solved, but it's probably been solved in at least 3 or 4 different ways. And speaking to those different people might give you a better understanding of what they've done, and completely change the brief to the pain of the talent team or the recruiters, and maybe the interviewers as well. But fundamentally, you're getting better information, and I think you should also be happy to say, look, we can improve this as we go. It's not, I didn't write it perfectly everything first time, right? Like, just as we approach engineering, we can iteratively improve these processes and specs. Yeah, no, of course. And I suppose then talking about constantly improving goes on to, I suppose, one of my favorite topics is what strategies then as engineering managers and leaders and CTOs can we put into place to sort of
further that constant improvement? You said, well, one of them obviously there, constant improving of an interview process, but what other things can we try and implement, or to make sure that diversity and inclusion is being addressed? Sort of, is there any strategies that people want to bring and identify, I suppose?
I mean, one of the first, one thing that I like to do is when I hire someone is ask for feedback. Like, can you explain me how you live the process? Like we try to do that even if we don't hire people, but for the people like goes farther in the funnel. But just having a conversation like can you share with me how you felt? Is there anything that you felt that was off, that you don't feel comfortable? Is there anything that you think it could be handled better? And by gathering these different inputs, you can have a little bit of an idea of, are we moving into the right direction? And also, I think we shouldn't take anything as static and stable. And we should always be looking for different ways to improve. So not like, oh, I got the process, it works, doesn't matter anymore. No, let's try always to think about it. When you open a position, let's be very mindful about it and put some effort. We expect people to put effort into applying. Let's put effort ourselves also when we are opening a position.
I think I would, so I guess, reiterate that idea of sort of constant processes. So, if we start, like we've been saying, at sort of the working processes within your company, how do you communicate? What are the working processes for these roles? These are things that should be reevaluated at least every 6 months, every year, to just go and say, what are the underlying tool sets? What are the underlying systems? What are the underlying ways that people work together? And just to make sure that those things still make sense to you, still properly represent the role without adding additional requirements that aren't actually requirements for that role, and then making sure that your hiring processes go and reflect those working processes. And I think that's something that you need to do again and again and again, because those things will change over time. Your understandings of those roles will change over time. Help the sort of the environment in which you are recruiting will change over time, and just making sure those things are constantly sort of matched up, I think, is really important.
Yeah, no, I think we've covered some unbelievable topics and so come up with some brilliant strategies and had a really informative discussion on these things. I suppose in terms of key takeaways, I think there's so many to go from especially the many eyes, many times, all the way to the fluff that Ben identified, and everyone's put some main things. I suppose, does anyone have any closing remarks on I suppose the interview process of D&I? Obviously we can go on for hours on everything within culture and processes that were implemented, but is there any closing remarks that anyone wants to make on this topic?
I think as an engineering manager or anyone who's in a leadership role, being the champion yourself is really important, and making people see it is also extremely important. So you champion this initiative and make sure it's people can see the benefits of it. I think that's the way the organizations would embrace it and embark on this continuous improvement journey that Toby was speaking about. Yeah,
no, completely agree. And obviously, I just want to say thank you to all of you. Obviously, there will certainly be more events that we'll be hosting on this topic, as always. And hopefully, this doesn't just, obviously, this will never just stop with one topic, does it? And it goes on, and more people talk about it, more strategies come out, and better education, as we alluded to earlier. So, thank you all very much. It's been great having you on. And hopefully this journey and continuous growth continues across the whole network.